Well, today I'm going to talk about property rights. Property rights are a very crucial instrument. I sometimes call them the mother of all instruments. A market economy cannot work without property rights, and we cannot define other policy instruments without thinking carefully about the structure of property rights in an economy. Property rights might seem obvious, but they're actually quite complex, and there is more variation than you would believe between different countries and different kinds of resource. We can start with land, and this is a piece of land in Sweden, and each little square there is, they're not necessarily square, but I mean each little parcel is a different piece of property with a different sort of registration number and belongs to someone, and there are maps in Sweden. Every single piece of land is accounted for. Occasionally, like the little tiny blue box there, a piece may be a common property resource that is actually not really private property, but it still belongs then, in this case, to the village as a whole, as a piece of common property. But most land in Sweden is either private property or state property. So we need to understand what is private property. What does ownership really entail? Well, we usually talk about 5 or 6 different kinds of right. One is the right of access. You have the right to go there, physically be on the property. You have the right of using it productively. If, for instance, you grow potatoes, then the potatoes are yours and you have the right to withdraw them. You have the right to set the management rules. The owner also has the right of excluding other people. And we have even the right, sometimes, not always, to sell, lease, or inherit property. I should say that there are a number of countries where you don't necessarily have that right fully. And you might have the right to destroy the property as well, the ultimate form of property alienation here. The origins of property go rather far back in time, and I would invite you to read chapter 3 of our textbook here. I had a lot of fun writing that chapter, and tried to trace back and understand where property rights come from. This document is one of the origins. Quite recently, someone in a little village in England found a copy of the Magna Carta that was earlier unknown. There are about a dozen copies. They were written in the mid-1300s and are one of the first accounts of property rights and other issues, taxes and laws, that was written in England. It's a little speculative, but we can go back to the animal kingdom also, and you can see things that are a little bit like property rights. If you try taking a bone from a dog, you will notice that he thinks it's his. And there have been a lot of studies of animal behavior. For instance, even a small dog can become so fierce when he is close to the center of his property, they are territorial, that he can sometimes fight successfully against a bigger dog. So there is some kind of relationship between property rights and aggression in dogs and in other animals. The first instruments that we can think of are related to demarcation of property rights, fences, for instance. And then you see there is an arrow of stone there, instruments that were intended to defend property rights. We can look at different kinds of property rights. We have private property first, and then the owner is an individual, and you can see what kind of rights he has the right of doing most things, but perhaps not everything. I mean, there can still be illegal uses of your private property, so you've got the right to do everything that is sort of legal and socially acceptable. There could be communal property, the next line down, and then there is state property. A lot of property in some countries, a lot, belongs to the state. And finally, there is something we call common access, which means that no one in particular, or maybe a group of people, has access and rights. And I will talk more about common property in another video, so we'll come back to that issue. In Sweden, private property is limited by a general right of the public to go into forests and pick, for instance, mushrooms, even to camp one night at a time, to withdraw water, to do all kinds of things on other people's private land. Try doing that in the United States, and you usually find out rather quickly that there is a difference in what is intended by the word private property. Now we want to understand eventually who has the right to emit carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide or perfluorocarbons or whatever into the atmosphere, and maybe radio waves and maybe noise and all kinds of other things. So I think we can start by looking at land, and then we can look at minerals and water and gradually infer something about rights to attributes that are more and more complex. In Mexico, for instance, what is under the ground belongs to the state. It used to be to the Spanish king, but then eventually that became the Mexican state. So that applies to oil, for instance. Whereas in the United States, if you find oil on your property, it is yours. Needless to say, the American property rights are actually more beneficial for a rapid development of the mining sector. There are some countries, quite a few in Africa, where nobody really owns, you don't really have private property of land. There used to be in Ethiopia, for instance, as in other places in Africa, a system where every generation or so people would gather in a village and they would say, well, this family only has one child and that family has 5 children, and so we'll reallocate the land so that it's more efficient and more fair and so on. And that system might seem crazy to some people today, but it worked for the whole of human development until quite recently, and so it has worked and served people well. But it is not the kind of property regime that is very doesn't provide an incentive to do land improvement, to, for instance, break your back in digging terraces or ditches or laying down pipes or something, because you might lose that land. So in an age when technology and investments are more important, this is a land ownership pattern that has some problems. Now, let's talk about water law. Water law and other wildlife, for instance, in Roman times was treated as a special category of things that Roman lawyers wrote about this as being owned by itself, for instance, wildlife. Water flows through property, and so it's harder to define. But there are a couple of doctrines, for instance, the riparian doctrine, that is also part of Roman law, actually, that says that the water belongs to the person who has the land that is adjacent. So riparian is coastal, sort of. And then the rights can still be circumscribed. You might have a right not to removing everything, but just to using the water as it passes through. Prior appropriation is a completely different concept and actually comes largely from California, where there were no landowners, no strong landowners anyway, and the first people to use water were the gold camp, the miners who set up gold camps. And they would claim, they would stake a claim. It had to be a publicly deposited claim. And they would say, well, we have a mine here, we're using this amount of water. And that became a right. And someone else could come along and also stake water, but if you were first in time, your right was stronger. And there are still cities in California who are paying to the heirs of people who staked rights like that. So that is a strong and important source of property and water. Then you have common property rights in Spain. I'll talk a little bit about that in the film on common property resource management. And there are whole legal and economic doctrines about how to think of water rights. And the Pigouvian principle, for instance, is that someone is upstream, they emit something into the water, they would be responsible for the damage that can occur downstream. The Coasian perspective is quite different, and we'll come back to that a little bit in a moment. I think there are lessons for environmental management in general. One is the prior appropriation principle. The first come, first served principle is quite strong in people's mental thinking. There's a big movement, somewhat leftist, radical, popular movement for instance, in Latin America, but not only Latin America, many places, saying that the land should belong to those who work it. And there is a sort of a resentment of absentee landlords who might be sitting in London drinking tea when far away someone is working their land, and there is the feeling that the people who work the land should control it and should own it. But what does that mean, for instance, for forests? Suppose the landowner wants to protect the forest and likes the beauty of the jungle as it is, and then someone comes and cuts down the forest. Well, in many cases, it's been shown by an economist called Binswanger, for instance, that a large part of the destruction of the Amazon is in fact due to the race for creating private property. If you go into an unclaimed area, or even an area that actually does belong to someone else, you cut down the forest, you put up some fences, some cows, and so on. You have developed the land, and you are often rewarded with property rights. So this can be a good way of getting property. Interestingly enough, and in a way a bizarre part of this, people who occupy even houses in, let's say, London or in Barcelona, they can actually eventually get ownership rights. And this has become quite a big problem for people who inherit property that may be very valuable, and then they don't use it for a while, and then someone else moves in, and there can be endless, and sometimes endless lawsuits, and sometimes the original owner will actually lose the land. So we have, it seems, humanity has some sympathy for the people who would use a resource as compared to the formal owners. And this is related to other areas in environmental economics. I hope you read more about this in chapter 3. It's limited how much we can say just here. But Ronald Coase has a very interesting and libertarian kind of perspective on this. He's an economist who got the Nobel Prize in 1991. Please read page 53 to have a look at this. Coase says that we should see the property rights as factors of production. They determine the level of profit an owner can get from a piece of property. And there is a fascinating discussion about a case where a piece of property is shared between a medical doctor and the owner of the house, who makes sugar, and he also makes a big noise when he makes the sugar, or makes sweets, cookies or something. He's a confectioner. And so who has the right? Does the confectioner and the owner of the house have the right to make his sweets? And does he have a right to make a noise, basically, in his own house? Or does the person who is renting, who is a medical doctor, does he have the right to silence? He needs silence because he needs to listen to his patients with the stethoscope. And the results of that discussion, I think, are interesting and a little surprising. So I leave that for you to read.